Hi everyone, Justin Golston here. And in this video, we're going to discuss discipline and disciplinary action. And for an organization to be effective, people need to exercise self-control. And in order to do that, that self-control of behaviors is known as discipline. And disciplinary action involves a penalty against an employee who fails to meet established standards. And in an attempt to persuade the employee, you have to put these standards in place, and these disciplinary actions need to be integrated within an organization. So Douglas McGregor, who is a popular theorist, he examined the effectiveness of policies related to discipline and came up with several guidelines that he referred to as the hot stove rules. And if you think of whenever you were growing up or whenever you were a child, your mother told you a number of things. And probably one of those things was to not touch a hot stove. So in relation to those things and reflecting back on that, that's how we're going to frame this from an organizational perspective. So whenever we're putting disciplinary action in place, if we think about whenever you were growing up and you would get close to the stove, your mother would give you a warning. She said, don't touch the stove, but you touched it anyway, and then you learned from that, right? So that's with warning. So you were warned not to touch the stove. You were warned not to perform a certain action within the organization, but you tested it anyway, and you learned from that. Okay. So when we talk about teaching with a purpose, you could say, you were getting close to the stove, but then your mother said, go ahead and touch that. Go ahead and touch the stove. You'll see what happens, right? So similar to that situation, within organization, there can be certain things that a manager will allow employees to do, and then those employees will learn from that experience. Okay. So in terms of consistency, if you continue to do a particular action, right, the system. So if everyone continues to do a certain action, the entire system will learn from that, right? So for example, if a number of individuals within an organization continue to turn in their time cards late, or they continue to approve time cards late, then there can be disciplinary action for the entire organization, and everyone will be impacted from that action. Now, the impersonal aspect can be very similar to that, in that disciplinary action can happen across the entire organization, across the entire department, where even if there are a small subset of individuals that caused an issue, the entire department, the entire organization is negatively impacted, and that individual or group of individuals will not be called out, but everyone is impacted by that action. Okay, so that's where the impersonal comes in. So for the immediate disciplinary action, that is where we're not going to wait to the end of the month. That's going to be where we're not going to wait to the end of the week, and that disciplinary action is going to happen immediately. And then finally, from this hot stove approach, the warm atmosphere. So if an action is performed, and if we want disciplinary action to happen, then we're going to create a what we refer to as a warm atmosphere where the supervisor will bring in that employee or group of employees and say ways in which they can improve without the harsh impact, such as go ahead and touch that stove. Go ahead, go touch the stove. See what happens. So we want to have a nice way to resolve these issues. So the last thing we're going to talk about within this module is the difficult conversations of demotions, terminations, and resignations. So if an employee's performance is inadequate or inappropriate, we need to move forward within the next steps. So whenever we're talking about demotions involve moving an employee to lower level duties, responsibilities, and in some cases, lower pay. This is generally the alternative to terminations. And when we go into terminations, that is where, that's a more traumatic event from an employee perspective. And it's important to note that whenever terminations happen, special care should be taking place to show respect for the person and to also ensure that there is no retaliation that is going to occur. Now, there have been events that have happened from employees where they're going to retaliate against those that terminated them. Okay. Now, we call out the late great Jack Welch in the intro to HR class, and one of the great statements that Jack Welch made is that from a workforce perspective, you have to love your employees on the way out the same way you love them on the way in. And that's one of my favorite Jack Welch statements, and that is very, 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 very important. Okay. Moving on to the termination of executives. The termination of executives is different than the termination of lower level employees. Most executives do have an employee contract that will identify things that will happen if those executives are terminated. And if an executive is terminated, they in most cases will have a separation package. This is sometimes referred to as a golden parachute, where payment is received if that executive is terminated, and because of this golden parachute model, it will sometimes be very expensive to cut ties with executives of organizations. Now, other issues for the termination of executives is that in order for a CEO to be terminated, the board of directors will actually control the termination of a CEO of an organization. Now, if a CEO of an organization, a high-profile CEO of the organization, or a high-profile chief operating officer or a chief financial officer is terminated from an organization, the company reputation may be affected. So stockholders. So if you own stock in a company and then you all of a sudden see that the CEO was terminated, okay, what's going on? With that company, that may cause doubts in that organization's capabilities, and that may have a negative impact on the organization as a whole. Okay. Also, so that would be an external example. Internally, if employees see that an executive, a chief operating officer or a chief executive officer was terminated by the organization, that may negatively impact the employee morale of the organization. So similar to how a stockholder would have concerns, now employees have concerns. So yes, it may come to a surprise from an external party as stockholder, but if I'm internal to the organization, I should see the writing on the wall. I should see performance issues of executives. So if a high profile executive is all of a sudden terminated from the organization in which I work in, you can have concerns from an employee perspective, from a workforce perspective, and that may decrease the productivity or performance within the organization. So moving on to resignation, rather than to face termination or demotion, some employees will just resign from an organization, which is where they will voluntarily leave the organization. So one thing that's important from an HR professional perspective is to conduct exit interviews. So if someone resigned from the organization, it's good to kind of do an exit interview to see, okay, why did they indeed leave the organization? Was it a management issue? Because there is a common statement that employees don't leave organizations, they leave managers, right? So is there a management issue within the organization? Is there better pay, somewhere? Are there additional opportunities somewhere outside of the organization? Those are the questions that you can ask during that exit interview. And then once again, those exit interviews are very important when people resign from the organization. Okay. And then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about within this module is going to be retirement. Now, retirement is one thing that's common from an organizational perspective. And this is the goal the holy grail is that we don't really have many demotions. We don't have many terminations. We don't have, many resignations, but we have a number of retirements. So if we have that, as an HR professional, we're doing our job. We are doing our job in working with each leader of each department to ensure that all employees are happy, and a number of employees are retiring from our organization. All right. So that is one thing. So once employees reach retirement age, that is another way to leave an organization. And from an HR perspective, another way to keep employees is to have a great retirement package within your organization. So that's all that we're going to discuss within this module, and I'll look forward to seeing you in module 3.